Conversation at your tables. My name is Rick Kress. I'm on the board of the Thanksgiving Roundtable for Southeastern Michigan. Glad to have you with us today, and glad to have you here in this particular webinar, or not webinar, but conference. What are we going to call this? Presentation. Yes, thank you. Glad, appreciate that. And I'm going to introduce our sponsor, Terry Lang, from Beaumont Hospital. Foundation.
Thank you. My name is Terry Lang. I'm actually on the board of the Plan Giving Roundtable. I'm the vice president of Plan Giving at the Beaumont Health Foundation. The foundation is a separate legal entity that does all the fundraising activities for Beaumont Health. And you probably know Beaumont Health is the 8-hospital system. It's the largest health system in Southeast Michigan. So the foundation conducts the full array of fundraising activities to raise funds annually to support the capital and operational needs of Beaumont Health. So it's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Fred Weber. He's the Estate Settlement Services Practice Leader for Northern Trust. Fred has a BA in International Relations and History from the University of Minnesota, and a JD from Paul University College of Law. Before Northern Trust, Fred practiced law as a trust, estate, and probate attorney, and also served as a plan giving officer for a large charity. As the Estate Settlement Services Practice Leader, Fred leads a team that manages relationships through death-related administration of estates and trust when Northern Trust acts as a fiduciary for the client who has died. He's a frequent speaker on topics related to death-related administration of estates and trusts. He's also an adjunct professor at the John Marshall Law School, where he developed and taught a course on death-related administration of estates and trusts. On the personal side, he's a happy husband, a proud dad of 3 boys, a diehard baseball fan, a music lover, a theater goer, and a Minnesota native who loves to bike, hike, read, run, and travel. So, welcome, Fred. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to just a couple quick things that I want to just acknowledge. So I come to this from the perspective of somebody who worked as a plan giving officer, so worked with donors, cultivating gifts, and just so you're all aware, it was my first job out of law school, and I was hired in Chicago by a gentleman named David Rosen, who's sort of legendary in plan giving circles, hired me right out of law school. When he hired me, I didn't know exactly what plan giving was. I learned quick, and I learned to actually love the work. But when I decided that I wanted to practice law, David was very understanding, and he said, you know, I get it. I would never stand in the way of anybody's career or any opportunity for you to, realize your dreams. But I will say this: if you leave this organization, you go to work in private law practice, you're going to probably be making more money, so I'm going to expect to see an increase in your annual campaign gift. So, fundraiser and he's still running the plan giving department at the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, and so I always have to throw that out there because he taught me everything that I know about plan giving. But I also learned a lot as I made the transition from doing estate planning work, where I was actually drafting the estate plan documents for donors like the ones you work with, and naming charitable beneficiaries. Because when I started practicing in private practice, I realized that not every organization had a sophisticated plan giving shop like the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago, like the University of Michigan, which I heard about this morning. I don't know if you were in on the history of philanthropy presentation. A development staff of 650 people. So I joked with a colleague who went to the University of Michigan, and there are a lot of them at Northern Trust here in Michigan, but also in Chicago. I said, the good news for all you Michigan alums, if any of you ever go missing, the development staff at the University of Michigan will be able to find you, right? You got 650 people, they will find you. So don't think, if you think you can get away, they'll find you. That's really remarkable. And I also thought it was really interesting that if what I understood was that the University of Michigan was the first public university to actually hire professional fundraising staff in the 1950s. So I guess you're on the cutting edge of something here, maybe, you know. But like I said, the best news for all of you is you're never going to be lost again, because they will find you. And then lastly, I just think, and so when I was practicing law, I realized that not a lot of organizations I learned very quickly when I was working with an estate planning client who wanted to leave a bunch of money to a big charitable organization. I figured that every charitable organization had a David Rosen and a staff of 6 or 8 or 10 people who would be willing to work with the family. And what I found was that, and this was 20 years ago, what I found was that they don't all have, you know, a lot of you probably work at organizations. If you're not working for the University of Michigan, you might be working for an organization where your development director, your plan giving officer, your major gifts person, and your bequest administrator are all the same person. Does anybody have that experience? Because that's another thing that I keep running into. And really, the point of this presentation is that not every organization is going to be able to afford a bequest administration staff. So what I like to think about it, and now as I've moved into the next phase of my career, which is basically a professional fiduciary. So at this stage of my career, I've gone from plan giving officer to estate planning attorney to professional trustee and executor. What I find so often, particularly with the smaller and medium-sized organizations, you're really good at the cultivation. You're really good at having those important conversations with your clients and getting your clients, getting them named, getting your organization named in your client's estate plan documents. And that's really, really important because obviously that's what makes the world go round. And I will say, you know, you have something in common with the corporate fiduciaries in that we both want to be named in estate plan documents. You guys want to be the beneficiaries, we want to be the fiduciaries. And I know that I have a bias in favor of corporate fiduciaries because one of them happens to employ me. But I can promise you that corporate fiduciaries are always going to do better by charitable beneficiaries than individuals in almost every case. And it's not because individual executors or individual trustees are bad people or are not necessarily capable, because some of them are exceedingly capable. But if sometimes if the individual who is acting as the executor, a child, a niece, a nephew, a spouse, is also a beneficiary, and they are connected to the other beneficiaries by blood and DNA and marriage, they're going to naturally, you know, gravitate towards the family. And maybe not on purpose and maybe not out of any nefarious intentions, they're just going to pay closer attention because their family has their ears and their family has their attention, and their family, they get together with their family for Thanksgiving dinner, and the other beneficiaries around the Thanksgiving table will say, so gee, Fred, are you almost finished with Grandma's estate? Because I could really use the money, right? You guys don't typically go to the Thanksgiving dinner with the family that includes the fiduciaries. So it's not necessarily that it's a bad situation, but I just think that charitable beneficiaries fare better. And so that's another reason why I'm particularly grateful to be here. And I'm also grateful for my colleagues here in Michigan who are sponsoring this conference, because I think it's a really important relationship between the plan giving world and the corporate fiduciaries and the professional fiduciaries and the estate planning community in general. The other thing that I wanted to highlight, and this was something I heard yesterday on the radio, lest anybody tell you that the work you're doing is not important, there are some incredible institutions that we, all of us rely on and use, and that began as estate gifts. And so just yesterday, I was listening to a story on the radio. The Smithsonian Institution, has anybody been there in Washington, D.C., right? Founded as a result of a gift from an estate of a British gentleman who died in 1829. James Smithson directed his estate to leave a bequest, get this, to the United States of America. He was a British guy. To establish at Washington, the Smithsonian Institution, an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. That was the bequest. So the work that you're doing and the asks that you're making are not just on your own behalf, they're on behalf of all of us. And that's the segue into why I want you to work more productively and effectively, and in some cases more assertively, with the fiduciaries that are settling the estates that you're benefiting from. So that's my transition. But I want to dive into the materials. So we know that estate planning is often a very complex process. There's lots of legalese and language that gets thrown around and used. But at the end of the day, we're talking about executing and carrying out people's wishes, their hopes, dreams, their plans for the future. So I don't like most of these words because I think they're confusing. Probate, inheritance tax, powers of attorney. But you're wading into an area that I think is probably more complicated than it needs to be. And so when you get the call or you get notified that your donor has died, and you usually get that call from an attorney or an executor or a trustee, I want you to think about a few things. First of all, there are some things that you should all have handy. One is an IRS Form W-9 with the tax ID number of your organization and an authorized officer who can sign that, because that's one of the first things. When we're settling an estate and we contact the charitable organization, first thing we're going to ask for, particularly if you're getting a share of the residue, but even if you're getting a specific distribution, we sometimes ask for it anyway, we're going to want a W-9 from your organization, not from you personally. A couple people have come up to me today and told me stories about being asked for their personal social security numbers in order to collect their gifts. I wouldn't do that. I would just, the tax ID number for your organization suffices. You're also going to want a copy of your determination of exempt status letter. If we're dealing with an estate and it's a taxable situation, we just want verification that you actually are an exempt organization, so that when we take the deduction on the state tax return, it actually qualifies for the charitable deduction. Not to say that you wouldn't get the money if you weren't a qualified charity, but we wouldn't get the deduction, and we just want to make sure that although it would be pretty rare for people to leave money to an organization that wouldn't be deductible. The other thing that we want is a resolution authorizing whoever signs that W-9 or whoever signs documents on behalf of the organization. We want a resolution, indicating that person is an authorized officer of the organization and can sign on behalf of the organization, can sign receipts, can sign the W-9, whatever it needs to be. We need to make sure, as a fiduciary, that we're dealing with people who are actually authorized to act on behalf of and bind the organization. So that's the third, and the fourth thing, and this was touched on in some of the sessions this morning, gift acceptance policies. It was interesting, in the philanthropy history conversation this morning, she asked if everybody had gift acceptance policies, and not all the hands in the room went up, and I think that made the presenter a little nervous. It made me a little nervous too, because the gift acceptance policy is your get out of jail free card if something comes your way, if it's toxic real estate or an asset that you're never going to be able to unload and it costs a lot of money to maintain. If you have a gift acceptance policy that kind of outlines what you can and can't accept, if you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation with a donor or with an estate where you don't want to accept the asset because you can't use it, or you won't be able to sell it and it will become more of a liability to you than an asset, it's nice to be able to hide behind your gift acceptance policy. And the other thing is if you see if there are restricted gifts, if there are gifts that say you have to be used for a specific purpose, and you can no longer satisfy that purpose, sometimes you can use your gift acceptance policy as a way to negotiate with the fiduciary that will allow you to get the gift and maybe broaden the whatever restrictions are on it. So those are the important documents. And when I was in plan giving, I was told to keep multiple copies of those in my desk drawer, so that whenever we got a call about a new bequest coming in, we had everything at the ready and we can move quickly. Because you know that sometimes executors and trustees don't move as quickly as they should. And we also know that there's a lot of hurry up and wait time during the process of death-related administration. So the more information that you're able to provide the executor with or the trustee with up front, that way nobody can blame you for slowing down the process, and that's important. And so the other thing I want to make sure is if when you're talking to clients who are leaving the assets to charity, encourage them to have conversations. So if you have a client, if you have a donor who is leaving money to your organization, and you know that they're leaving money to other organizations, this goes back to the communication conversation, encourage them to bring those other organizations into the conversation as well. I think one of the biggest challenges we face in death-related administration is we don't always know who the players are. So if the donor has engaged with multiple organizations, it's nice to have them all kind of at the table, and it's also nice for the family because you want to try to get the family on board. So if there are family members who you think might take issue with the fact that they're leaving money to charity, try to engage those family members and say to your donors, look, when the time comes, when the money is ready to be distributed and delivered, make sure that there are no surprises, basically. And I think you have a lot of opportunities to do that. And I also know from my work in Plain Giving that many times you are the most trusted advisor for the donor that's leaving a lot of money to your organization. I see this a lot with the universities. The people are really loyal to their alma mater, and they're really loyal alums, and they really want to involve the organization. The other thing is, somebody talked about declarations of intent this morning, said, it was a great line. He said it's basically a paper handshake, like when you're booking your gifts. So I think it's also really important for people to understand the difference between a declaration of intent and an actual provision in a will or a trust. Not necessarily for you, the professionals in the room, but for your donors, because I think sometimes donors will sign declarations of intent and they will think that it will sort of take care of itself because they didn't hear you when you said it was non-binding, and that in order to back it up with something binding, you actually had to name the organization in your will or your trust. Sometimes your donors miss that point. As I mentioned earlier, you spend a lot of time cultivating, a lot of time stewarding, and you're always looking to get your organization named. And what I keep running into periodically is situations where once the death occurs, the charitable beneficiaries can occasionally be a deer in the headlights. And I want to share with you a letter. I serve on the board of a small organization, and this has been embellished a little bit, but I want you to think about some of the issues as I read this, and I'll try to do it quickly. But I've changed the names to protect the guilty, but this was a letter that the organization that I sat on the board of got from a law firm in Chicago, a law firm that we know well. I didn't know this individual attorney, but I knew several of her partners. And so just for the sake of covering up the guilty, it was from the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. The letter was from Eric Stratton, Esquire, attorney at law, addressed to Mr. Greg Marmalard, double secret director of gift planning at Faber College, regarding the estate of John Blutarski, deceased. Dear Mr. Marmalard, and the letter, by the way, is dated March 31st, 2019. As legal counsel for the executors of the estate of the late John Blutarski, it is my pleasure to enclose a check payable to Faber College in the amount of $250,000. The enclosed check represents the full and complete distribution of Faber's 1% share of the residue of Mr. Blutarski's estate. By way of background, Mr. Blutarski died a resident of Boston, Massachusetts on March 1st, 2016. His executors and trustees, all of whom wish to remain anonymous, have completed the death-related administration of Mr. Blutarski's estate and trust, and are now in the process of distributing the remaining assets to the various individuals and charities that Mr. Blutarski named as beneficiaries entitled to shares of his estate and trust. While he never actually graduated, Mr. Blutarski was a proud alum of Faber. He also had a particular affinity for the Faber chapter of the Delta Tau Chi fraternity, where he spent most of his 7 years in Hanover. While Mr. Blutarski's relationship with Faber did not end well, he remained loyal and grateful to Faber and to his Delta Tau Chi brothers. As such, Mr. Blutarski directed that all of the funds to which Faber is entitled under the terms of his will and trust are to be used exclusively for the benefit of the Delta Tau Chi, the Faber chapter of the Delta Tau Chi fraternity. Mr. Blutarski was very concerned about his legacy and felt very strongly that the success he achieved following his departure from Faber College was largely attributable to the lifelong friendships he formed with the men of Delta Tau Chi. Those who knew Mr. Blutarski know that he was not exactly a model student. They're also likely to be surprised at the wealth that Mr. Blutarski accumulated given his less than mediocre academic performance. as his longtime attorney, friend, and Delta Tau Chi brother of more than 30 years, you have my personal assurance that all of Mr. Lutarski's wealth, including the funds represented by the enclosed check, was amassed via moral, ethical, and completely legal business endeavors. And if you'll pardon my digression, but if you could please sign the enclosed receipt and release acknowledging the full and complete distribution of all amounts owed to Faber College by the John Lutarski Estate and Trust, and return to me in the enclosed envelope, my clients would greatly appreciate it. So, any problems with that? How many of you, if you walked into your offices tomorrow, would be thrilled to see a $250,000 check? I know I would, right? How many would cash that check? Yeah. So this is, again, embellished a little bit, but not that far off. The organization was notified 3 years after the death. That's completely unacceptable. Okay? They were entitled to a share of the residue, which means what? It means they're entitled to a full accounting and total transparency in the process. There was none of that. And does anybody pick up, the check was for a very round number. Has anybody ever had a situation where an estate, where 1% of an estate or 5% of an estate came out to an exact dollar amount, right? So these are things that sometimes happen. There may or may not have been nefarious intentions behind them. There was some sloppiness, and I actually did talk to the attorney, and I said, you know, you cannot keep an executor or trustee's identity confidential. For sure, an executor, I mean, you file a will if they got appointed by a court, and I can't remember if there was actually a probate estate here, if they opened probate or not, if all the assets were in trust. But you can't keep, and there's certain things you absolutely, by law, have to share with the beneficiaries, regardless of what your client wants. I mean, if you're a lawyer and a trustee comes into your office and says, I'm trustee of Mr. Lutarski's trust, and I don't want anybody to know about this, and I don't want you to tell them, you know, any of the information, any of the details, you have to say, no, if that's what you want, I can't represent you. And that's kind of what I told this lawyer. I said, you know, I get that you have a difficult client, but you have to be able to tell the client there's certain things that just won't fly. And I said, I want to know what you're getting paid, your law firm is getting paid to represent these folks. I want to know what the executors and trustees are getting paid. And by the way, I want to see a copy of the federal estate tax return, which gets me to my point about being assertive. There's a lot of information that is owed to charitable beneficiaries, and you need to kind of step up and ask for it. And sometimes, I would say most of the time, if you're not getting the information, it's not because somebody's lying to you or cheating you or trying to steal from you. It's because they're either not getting good advice from the attorney that they're working with, or they just don't know what their responsibilities are. They think of estate planning, you know, when our donors and our clients think that this is what happens, right? You put the donor names, the charity in the will, the client eventually dies, whatever money is set aside for the heirs is delivered to them, and then the charity gets its money, and we all go home, and it's all hunky-dory from there, and there's never any problems. But we know that what it really looks like is more like this, right? And that's the other piece of this, right? You need to be assertive with the fiduciaries, but you also need to be realistic about your expectations as to how long it actually takes to deliver the gift, right? So if you're getting a specific distribution or a specific request under the will of $10,000 or $50,000 or pick a number, as soon as that gift, as soon as you receive that payment, then your economic interest has been satisfied, and there's no additional duty to account to your organization once you've been paid. But between the date of death and the date you get paid, there's a lot of information that you're entitled to, and it varies, and I'll get into this in a minute, it varies depending on the type of interest you have. But for specific cash distributions, which are pretty straightforward and pretty easy, you still want to be able to see the language in the trust agreement. So if it's a trust, and it says, I leave, you know, $50,000 to the University of Michigan, you need to see that language. You may not be entitled to see a complete copy of the trust agreement, but I would say you want a certification of, you want to see the first page indicating the trust was established. You want to see evidence that the right trustee is acting, so you want to see the provisions that appoint the successor trustee, or if it's a will, the successor, the personal representative. You want to see the trustee powers. You want to see the specific paragraph that says what your organization is getting, and you want to probably see a signature page and a date. Truth be told, if you're getting $50,000, it's probably none of your business what the other beneficiaries are getting, because that doesn't impact you as long as you get your $50,000. So don't necessarily just take someone's word for it that $50,000 is all you're entitled to. In fact, I was talking about this issue with my old boss, David Rosen, just the other night, and he had a situation where they got a letter in the mail, notifying them of somebody's death, and that under the terms of the trust, they were entitled to $10,000. But they didn't include a copy of the language in the trust. So David calls up the lawyer and says, could you send us a copy of the provision in the document that shows that we're getting the $10,000? A week or two later, he gets a creepy phone call back from the attorney for the executor. Says, oh, we made a mistake. Your interest was actually $25,000. My apologies. Your letter got sent to the wrong charity. There was a paperwork mix-up. Here's the provision, and you're getting 25 instead of 10. Now, you can say that was certainly sloppy. It could have been nefarious. It could have been ill will. It could have been an honest mistake. But my point is, don't be afraid to ask for the information that you're entitled to. And if you take nothing away from this presentation, that's what I hope you'll take away, is that you need to be bold and be assertive with the fiduciaries you're working with, whether it's an individual fiduciary or a corporate fiduciary. Notice is one of those things that people don't quite realize, and I love this little cartoon, right? Public notice, and then if you look, it's actually, nobody would see it. That kind of notice not acceptable in these situations, particularly if you're getting a share of the residue. Because when you're getting a share of the residue, that gets a little more complicated. But you need to make sure that you're getting the right kind of notice, and that the notice that they're delivering to you is actually complying with whatever the local statutes are, or the local laws. People think I'm crazy, but I'm actually a big fan of probate, because in a lot of jurisdictions, if you get the will admitted to probate, even if there are no assets in the estate because all the assets have been put into the revocable trust prior to death, or the assets passed by beneficiary designation, if you open a probate proceeding, even for an estate that has no assets, in most jurisdictions, and I think Michigan is one of them, it's not that complicated to just get the will admitted and get the statute and the claims and contest periods running. And then you can actually, if there is a dispute or if there is an issue regarding the trust or the will, you have a forum available to you to go in and either file your claim or question what the fiduciaries are doing, or demand an accounting and get the court to order it. So I think it's very important to pay attention to those provisions, and with very few exceptions, you should hear from the executor or the trustee within 90 days of death at the most. Hopefully it's going to be sooner than that, but the fiduciary should be reaching out to the beneficiaries within 30 to 60 days. So if you know that your donor has died and you know that you were named in the estate plan and 90 days have gone by, pick up the phone and call the drafting attorney, call somebody if you can figure out who the executor or trustee is, but don't just sit and hope that 3 years later you're going to get a letter and a check and be asked to sign a receipt. It's just really important that you're a part of this, you have a financial interest, and by the way, you also have a fiduciary duty to the donors and to the public that funds you. So if you're concerned about questioning what an executor or trustee is doing, just remember, just like they owe a fiduciary duty to your organization to carry out the terms of the estate of the will or trust, you owe a fiduciary duty to the public and to your donors to make sure that you get everything that's coming to you and that you're treated appropriately in the process. So I think it's just something that, the other thing is managing expectations. So I said you should get notified within 90 days. Does that mean you're going to get your money? And I will say, in your world, I talk about kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews are always calling and asking for money. Everybody, like when somebody dies, all of a sudden, all their family suddenly needs money. My favorite one situation was I had a guy, did a settled estate a few years back for a guy, 62 years old and healthy, right? Never married, no kids, suddenly drops dead of a heart attack. Horrible tragedy. His 2 adult nieces, who he was very close with and who he loved very much, were the 2 beneficiaries of his estate. He had done an estate plan, but when he died, he wasn't expecting to die. So he didn't really have his affairs in order. There were assets all over the place. He had bank accounts and he had investment management accounts. We had to consolidate all the accounts, get everything together, kind of figure out what we had. We had a house to sell. It was sort of your normal. He died in, I want to say it was January or February. So he hadn't filed his income tax return from the year before. We also were going to have to file his final income tax return for the year that he died. And we met with the nieces probably 3 weeks after he died, and we kind of started the process. And sometime toward the end of March or early April, I get a call from one of the nieces telling me that it was a little awkward, but she and her husband had sold some property and they took a big capital gains tax hit, and April 15th was coming up and they owed a pretty large income tax bill. Could they get a distribution so that they could pay their income tax bill that was coming due on April 15th? And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, how would you have paid this tax bill if your uncle hadn't suddenly dropped dead of a heart attack 2 months ago? I didn't say that, of course. I said, I can't help you because we just got appointed. We're just in the process of gathering the asset information. Your sister is also a beneficiary, and I don't have money to distribute. I mean, even if I wanted to, I couldn't. And by the way, we haven't run a claims or a contest period. This guy was single, never married. Like I wanted to make sure that before we distributed a nickel, there weren't any. I mean, God forbid there were some children out there that we didn't know about. I mean, these are the things that fiduciaries have to think about, right? So I think in your world, the analogy to the nieces who suddenly need money is your boards of directors, and I say that as a board member myself. But I know that when you get notified of a death, say it's you get notified of a death in March or April, and your fiscal year, maybe your organization's on a June 30th fiscal. Anybody ever had that call from a board member or a finance person says, if we could get that bequest in before the end of our fiscal year, then our numbers are really good. Or if we could push back to the next fiscal year, whatever it is, you have to kind of manage the expectations of your board members, because sometimes your board members who are wonderful giving people who are really supportive of your organizations, they see the dollar signs when somebody dies. So you need to try to educate them a little bit on the length of time and the process for settling an estate. Sometimes we can get partial distributions out within the first year or less, depending. Sometimes we've even had situations where we've pushed out specific distributions for a couple of reasons. One, because we had the cash. Two, possibly the estate, the trust, and will contest periods have expired, so we're comfortable. And three, if we're dealing with like a multi-million-dollar estate and there's a bunch of $50,000 bequests or $10,000 bequests, once we pay those out, then it shrinks the pool of individuals and organizations that we have to work directly with. Because once we pay them, they're gone. They still may call and ask questions, but at the end of the day, you're shrinking your group of interested parties down to a more manageable number for the fiduciary. So, but it's pretty rare that you're going to get any money, within 6 months of the death. It's going to be at least 6 months, and sometimes it's more than a year. And I was actually in a meeting with an attorney a couple weeks ago who was advising her clients that the process of fully settling a complex taxable estate can take up to 5 years. And that's true, but the caveat there is it doesn't mean you're going to have to wait 5 years to get your money. You'll probably get some money along the way if you're getting a share of the residue, but just know that it may take that long because people die with all kinds of weird assets that are hard to sell, that are hard to value, and all kinds of issues. And I tell people all the time, tax planning is important, but the biggest challenges we face in estate settlement are people and assets. You have crazy family, and you've invested in crazy assets. Your family, you can't sell them, and sometimes your crazy assets, you can sell them eventually, but they're hard to sell, or they're hard to, sometimes they're hard to give away. Just commercial. Don't encourage your clients to buy timeshares. They're the worst assets to own in an estate because there's no secondary market for timeshares. That's your estate settlement public service announcement. But help manage the expectations. Finding and collecting assets can take a long time sometimes. When somebody dies, the executor and the trustee is essentially responsible for everything that you owned and everything that you owed on the day you took your last breath. So the best way to think about that is, if I said to any one of you in this room, tell me where are all your bank accounts? Where are your credit cards? Which bank has your mortgage, your car payment? What strange, interesting assets do you have? Do you have anything scheduled on your homeowner's insurance policy? Jewelry, estate property, car collect, whatever it is. And your IRA and your 401k from 3 jobs ago that you haven't moved into an IRA yet, or whatever it is. We all, if you look at your own personal balance sheets of what you own and what you owe, it's a lot of information. And it's great. If I asked you for that and you're alive and well and healthy, you could probably give me a lot of information off the top of your head, but probably you could come back within a few days with a spreadsheet and you can probably give me some pretty good detail as to where all of your assets and liabilities lie and how we would access them. The problem is when your executor or your successor trustee is asking the question, you're not around to answer it because you're dead. So it's really the tracking and keeping, and the other secret, you want to know the real secret to a simple estate settlement process? Live long, die liquid, and consolidate all of your assets with a single institution. I guarantee you, it'll be much easier on your family and on your beneficiaries if you die with a large estate after a long life that can be quickly reduced to cash, and that we can fund. Right? So Swiss bank accounts, not so good. But just think about that. But I also know that's not realistic, that we can't all expect to live long, and even those of us who live long sometimes don't always consolidate all their assets. But start thinking about that for, as you age, that the process can be really, really cumbersome. We also, as I mentioned, there's lots of different types of assets that people can own. Family businesses, closely held business entities are among the toughest because no two are alike. Sometimes there's a market for them, sometimes there's not. Sometimes there's restrictive buy-sell agreements. Sometimes the business that was worth millions of dollars the day before the owner died is worth nothing because the owner was the business on the day after he died or she died. We've found stock certificates in basements and in freezers, safe deposit boxes, real estate. Once upon a time, for those of you old enough to remember pre-2008, if somebody died owning residential real estate, you put that sucker on the market, and 45 days later, you had a closing, and you were getting a check or getting wired funds. We are now running into, in the estate settlement world, big challenges with real estate. Even straight up simple residential real estate, the market has gotten more fickle. Unless the residence is in a really hot neighborhood or a really hot market, we struggle sometimes to unload vacation properties in Arizona and Florida, and then really our ability to sell residential real estate varies from market to market and from neighborhood to neighborhood. And I can promise you, if you were fortunate enough to say, if your parents lived in the same house for 40 years, and it was the house you grew up in, when they die, because all your childhood memories are attached to that house, when it comes time to sell it, I guarantee you're going to think it's more valuable than any other independent buyer out there, I promise you. Because they're not just buying your parents' house, they're buying all of your childhood memories, which by the way are worthless to them, but they're incredibly valuable to you. And so that's another, manage expectations around real estate. As I said, cash is easy. Jewelry, any precious metals, those are actually fairly easy to unload. But there is provenance. We also know that tangible personal property is probably the #1 cause of anxiety and fighting within families. And so there's not much as a charitable beneficiary you can do about that. If the kids are going to fight over the jewelry and the watches and stuff, sometimes you just have to kind of sit back and wait and hope that they work it out and that they don't drain the estate of legal fees and expenses. But just, try to be cognizant of some of the assets that are there. And as you're being kind of assertive and trying to hold your fiduciaries accountable, just, try to understand that, this $10 million estate may be held up because 3 of the kids are fighting over a $500 watch. And sometimes spending tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees to fight over that $500 watch. It's unfortunate, but it happens. The other piece of advice I say to people is that as you age, and you're starting to think about downsizing, when your kids or your grandkids, or if you live long enough, your great-grandkids come to visit, start giving stuff away. I had an aunt who lived to be 92 years old, and every time I visited her, I left with something. So by the time she moved into assisted living, there was like nothing left in her house because she always had a lot of visitors. She lived in a place where a lot of people like to go, and she was a great hostess. And so, family or not, you would leave with a book. I have a crystal wine goblet, a hand-blown crystal wine goblet that she gave me. And the funny story was, she gave me, on one of my last visits before she moved into assisted living, I got this beautiful dessert plate. It was like this carved ceramic thing, and she said, take it. So 6 months later, my cousins were at her house, and they were moving her into assisted living. And my cousin Liz calls me up, and she said, did Mom give you a plate, a few months ago when you were here? She said she gave you this plate that I think belonged to somebody else in the family, and she described it to me, and I said, oh, yeah, do you want it back? She said, no. She said, it was actually one of a set of 12, so congratulations, you're getting the other 11 plates. So a couple weeks later, I got a package in the mail with the other 11 plates. My aunt was very much alive. It was her decision, pushed by her cousin, by her daughter, who did not want to be dealing with this stuff after she was gone. But I know those seem sort of like weird conversations to have, but the truth of the matter is you cannot take it with you. So, as you're thinking about downsizing and decluttering, it'll make your estate go easier. We know that valuation is also an issue. Again, if you're getting a percentage of the residue, you need to know the value. Even if the estate is not taxable, the executor or the trustee still needs to obtain fair market value valuations of business interests, tangible personal property. What I tell people is, because so few estates these days actually pay estate tax, a lot of times we get pressure when people say, well, you don't really need to pay for appraisal, do you? Well, the problem is, I can't tell if that gold watch is real gold or if it's fake. I can't tell if that's a real diamond or a real whatever. I can't tell if that business interest has real value or if it's worthless. And so appraisals, even in situations where you're not paying tax, and even if it's 100% charitable, are still a really important tool for fiduciaries because, one, it gives them, it holds them accountable. But if you're getting a percentage of the residue, you want to know what those values were, even if there's no tax due, because you also want to know if you are going to sell those assets, you want to make sure that you're setting the right price and that you're not giving them away, because that's another thing that fiduciaries just can't sell. Everybody has the story of the old lady down the street dies and 6 of the neighbors are knocking on the door wanting to buy the house because they want to get a deal, right? Well, if the executor, whether it's a kid or a bank, if they give that neighbor a deal and they sell that property for below its fair market value, then they've breached their fiduciary duty to the beneficiaries, which are all of you. So, people complain about the cost of valuations and the time and the involvement, but it's really an insurance policy for the fiduciary. It's also an insurance policy for you to make sure that you're getting the actual value for the assets and that your share is being enhanced, protected, preserved, what have you. So don't be afraid of valuation work, and it is an insurance policy both for the beneficiaries and the fiduciaries, and it is also provides another mechanism for you to hold the fiduciary accountable. So you should probably be insisting that they dot their I's and cross the T's when it comes to valuation. Information is just so important to gather as much information prior to the death, But then when we start the process after a death occurs, we are basically scavengers. We are looking everywhere for anything. And then once we determine that you have an interest that is going to be impacted, so you get to share the residue, that's going to be impacted by debts, expenses, taxes, etc., then you're entitled to a full accounting of every nickel that has come in and every nickel that goes out from the date of death until we terminate the trust, close the estate, and distribute the last dollar. Why is that? Because everything we spend on expenses affects you. So every state requires executors and trustees to account annually, at least annually, to anybody who has a financial interest, an actual financial interest in the estate or trust. So in my letter example, these attorneys, they were supposed to be providing us with accountings literally from day one, which they didn't do, or their client didn't do, and they didn't insist on it. So if you're getting a share of the residue, you're entitled to a full accounting from the date of death until the last dollar is distributed. And what does that mean? It really means you're entitled to total transparency in the process. So if, in the case of a corporate fiduciary, we're typically going to set you up to receive monthly account statements from the account that's managing all the assets. And so you're going to get the account statements, you're going to see transactions. So if you see that we paid the law firm, $6,000, if you think, well, $6,000, maybe that's a little bit much, call the fiduciary, call the trustee and say, can I see a copy of that bill? And if they say, I'm not going to show it to you, then that's a red flag, because you're entitled to see it. We don't generally make a habit of giving copies of the estate tax returns to all the residuary beneficiaries, but if you think that there's information on that tax return that you would want, if somebody asks for it, we provide a copy. We don't do it as a matter of course, because if any of you've seen an estate tax return, sometimes it's the size of a New York City phone book, for those people old enough to remember what phone books look like. But the idea is that not only are you entitled to the accounting, if you want to ask about the backup information, if you want to know, are we paying too much? That was my biggest concern when I got this letter, was how much is the lawyer charging for all this? How much is the executor charging? I knew none of that. And yet, it was going to impact this organization's interest. And in this case, it was a tiny little organization with $1 million annual budget and a staff of 5 people. So, you really want to make sure that you get the information you're entitled to, and you want to demand it. Liabilities, we know that everybody dies owing somebody something. Again, that's information that becomes available to you when you're getting the annual accountings. So if there are any outstanding debts and you're not satisfied with what you see in the accounting, you can ask for the backup documentation. So there's also expenses. I also sometimes want to know what the funeral cost, right? If I'm getting 1% of the estate, and I say this, in our world, we pay a lot of funeral bills, right? I've paid on the low end, a $1,200 cremation service, right? All inclusive. On the high end, I settled a very large estate for a very, very wealthy man, and it was a huge funeral service at a big fancy church, and then followed by a sit-down lunch at a country club for almost 200 people. It was like a wedding, right? Now, that funeral cost close to $200,000. Now, that seems excessive to most of us, but in context, it wasn't, because this guy knew a lot of people, and that's the kind of funeral he wanted, and his family gave him what he wanted, and it was almost a $200 million estate. But context matters, and so you need to understand the context. If they had spent $200,000 on a funeral and the estate was $1 million, I would want to know where they got off doing that. And by the way, in our situation, our bigger concern was that the IRS might question the $250,000 or the $200,000 estate tax deduction for funeral expenses, but they didn't, and I think probably because of the context. So there's a lot of information behind the line items, and if you have any questions or you're concerned, first of all, you should be getting the information, and if there's any information that you think is questionable, you should ask. Income and estate tax. Estate tax, as I said, is not as big of an issue these days because fewer and fewer estates are actually taxable. but it doesn't mean there's no need to appraise and value. And there are often income tax implications. So people need to be aware of the fact that just because an estate doesn't owe estate tax, they may owe income tax, either capital gains or whatever it is. And sometimes, if it's all charitable, sometimes that gets zeroed out. But just know that there's income tax, both the individual income tax returns of the decedent, as well as the fiduciary income tax returns that have to be prepared annually. And that's another thing you can share with your boards of directors. But I think tax is less of a big issue than it was several years ago, but it's still something to think about. Just remember that there's income tax liabilities and there's income tax compliance. Quick about wills versus trust. Most people know the difference, but the main thing to remember is that a will is a public document. Even if you don't open a probate proceeding, the will still has to be made public. Trusts are less public. I say less public, why? Because there's information in the trust that you might be entitled to if you're a beneficiary of, as I said, a specific distribution, but you may not be entitled to see the entire document if your interest has been satisfied or if you're not sharing in the residue. I also think that the greatest value in using revocable living trusts and funding them while you're alive is more related to privacy than probate avoidance, right? When you probate a will and there are actual assets in the estate, you have to file an inventory and that becomes a public record. So I think the more compelling argument for the funding of revocable trusts during life is to keep the asset information private. So those are kind of the key differences. But again, if you're entitled to a share of the residue, they can't keep the document private from you, and they can't keep the accountings private from you, and they certainly cannot keep the identity of the trustees private from you. That's taking that a little too far. I'll skip one. We talked about specific pecuniary and residuary. The one thing that I will say, pecuniary is a cash gift. Residuary I've talked about ad nauseum. Specific assets. If there are specific assets that are bequeathed to your organization that are not necessarily consistent with the mission of your organization, and they're assets that you won't be able to sell, stand behind your gift acceptance policy, or ask the executor or trustee if they would be willing to sell the assets for you and distribute the proceeds. They may charge for that, but if they make it not your problem, then you can get out of owning an asset and insuring and paying the expense on an asset that isn't consistent with your mission and that you don't necessarily want and you can't unload. Again, the right to information varies, but at the end of the day, your trustees and executors have to keep very accurate records of everything they do, and they must be delivered to the beneficiaries whose interests are impacted by those expenses. So keep the process as transparent as possible, and make sure that you come to these conversations armed with as much information as possible. And I'm going to skip over this because you all know the difference between a 501c3 and a private foundation. But just, for fiduciaries, sometimes there's deductibility differences, and private foundations tend to be a little bit more challenging to administer than public charities. And then manage the expectations of your beneficiary, of your board, in your case, your boards of directors, when it comes to when are you going to get the money, and tell them that it's not going to be driven by the fiscal year end of the organization or whether you have a specific or certain need. Just make sure that you share the knowledge you have of this process with the lay people on your board who may not actually have this kind of experience. Finally, I'll just close with this. I said it before at the beginning, and I realize I'm biased, but I think when we're talking about charitable beneficiaries and corporate fiduciaries, we make great partners for one another. It's a win-win, and I assure you that you're going to be treated better, whether it's Northern Trust or anybody else. So think about how we can help you, and we'll think about how we can help you. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I will stick around for questions, and that's it.
All right, thank you very much. We have a gift for you as our speaker. It has cleared probate, and you are the sole beneficiary.
Are you sure?
There is no doubt.
Thanks.
You can share it with whomever you like.
Nice.
Time for a quick question or two?
Yeah.
What would you suggest about was a record documented, they made an estate gift. Of course, there was no documentation except for the razor's edge note. The volunteer has been in assisted living for 10 years. She's recently passed away. So there are no children, no contacts. Like we've checked probate. There is no document of her will. Where do you suggest we kind of go to discover what we might be entitled to from that perspective?
Do you know where she was living when she died?
Yes.
The assisted facility.
I mean, you might start there to see if they have a contact, because they may be owed some money for her care, for her care. That might be a good place. I mean, those are the trickier ones where there is no contact, but you really are, you sleuth. But I would start with the facility where she lived, and explain to them that you were told several years ago that you may be a beneficiary under her estate plan, and you'd like to know if there's a family contact or an executor or an attorney or an accountant or somebody they can put you in touch with. I mean, it's entirely possible that she changed her documents and didn't, but I think you have to try to pursue it, and I think that's where I would start if that's the only. The other thing is, you can go to like Social Security Death Index. You could look in different places online. There's a lot of stuff out there, but I would start with the facility where she lived and see if they have any family contact or a funeral home, if there was a funeral home that was involved, because somebody had to do something with her remains.
All right, thank you.
Our plenary session that closes out today is at 2 o'clock in the main room, and it's tools for enhancing your effectiveness as a gift planning professional. Please remember to fill out your evaluations, and thanks again to our speaker, to our sponsor, and for you being a part of this.